Did you know that Moses, one of the most revered figures in history, committed sins so shocking they may change the way you view his legacy? That's right. Moses, the man chosen by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, was far from perfect. In fact, there are moments in his life that have been deliberately hidden from most religious teachings, moments that paint a far more human and flawed picture of the man who spoke to God face to face. And today, we're going to reveal the shocking truth about the sins Moses committed. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to learn may challenge everything you thought you knew about this biblical giant. We all know Moses as the faithful servant of God. The one who parted the Red Sea, who led the Israelites through the desert for 40 years. But what if I told you that Moses was not just a man of unwavering faith and virtue? What if there were moments where he fell from grace, moments where he doubted God's plan, moments where he, too, struggled with sin and temptation? These are not the kinds of stories we often hear about Moses. We've been told that he was a perfect instrument of God's will, but today, we're about to challenge that narrative. Let's start with one of the most shocking and controversial moments in Moses' life, his outburst of anger at the rock. You may remember the story of Moses striking the rock to bring forth water for the Israelites. It's a well-known story. God told Moses to speak to the rock, but in his frustration, Moses struck it twice instead. God had commanded him to speak, not strike, and because Moses disobeyed, God punished him. But this incident goes much deeper than just disobedience. Moses was angry, frustrated, and, perhaps for the first time in his life, he acted out of anger instead of faith. This was a sin that led to a monumental consequence. Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land. Yes, after all his struggles, his trials, and his leadership, Moses' sin cost him the ultimate reward. Is it possible that Moses' anger was a reflection of a deeper struggle within him? Now, think about this for a moment. Moses, the man who spoke to God directly, was capable of such profound disobedience. Was this moment of anger a one-time mistake, or was it something that reflected a deeper flaw within him? Some biblical scholars believe that Moses' sin at the rock reveals a larger pattern of human frailty, a pattern that may have influenced his leadership and his relationship with God in ways we don't fully understand. But that's not all. Another shocking sin of Moses is tied to an incident that occurred earlier in his life. Long before he became the great leader of the Israelites. When Moses fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian who was beating an Israelite slave, he became a fugitive. He spent years in Midian, away from Egypt, and during that time, he faced moments of personal crisis. But did you know that during this period, Moses, who was once a prince of Egypt, was not living a life of piety or holiness? He had committed a grave sin by taking the life of another human being. This act of violence, which we often overlook in the grand narrative of Moses' life, was the first significant sin in his journey. It was an act of anger and revenge, not faith or righteousness. It's easy to forget that Moses, before becoming a leader of his people, was a man full of imperfections, and this sin haunted him for years, and it doesn't stop there. In another lesser-known story, Moses' faith was tested when the Israelites began to grumble and complain about their hardships in the wilderness. They were tired, hungry, and frustrated, and instead of showing compassion and understanding, Moses became exasperated with their constant whining. At one point, he even prayed to God, asking why he had burdened him with such a difficult task. Moses' anger and frustration reached a boiling point, and he was on the verge of abandoning the people he had fought so hard to lead. In this moment of despair, Moses' sin wasn't necessarily an act of commission, but an act of omission. He failed to show the kind of patience and trust in God that would be required to lead his people to the promised land. His lack of trust in God's plan was a sin of the heart, and it created a ripple effect that would later manifest in other moments of rebellion and doubt. You might be wondering, how could Moses, this great man of God, commit such sins? How could someone who parted the Red Sea, who stood in the presence of God, be capable of such moments of failure and rebellion? The answer is simple: Moses, despite his extraordinary calling, was still human. And as a human, he faced the same struggles, doubts, and temptations that we all do. His life was a testament to the reality that even the greatest among us are not exempt from sin. But what makes Moses' story so compelling is how God continued to use him despite his flaws. God didn't give up on Moses after his outburst at the rock. He didn't abandon him after the murder in Egypt. In fact, Moses was given one of the most incredible responsibilities in history, leading an entire nation to freedom. But that's what makes Moses' sins so profound: they didn't disqualify him from his calling. Instead, they revealed the depth of God's grace and the power of redemption. Despite Moses' sins, God still used him for his divine purposes. Moses' story is a reminder that no one is beyond redemption, no matter how great their failings may be. Now, let's turn to another controversial moment in Moses' life: his decision to marry Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest. While it may seem like a simple marriage, it was anything but ordinary. In fact, Moses' marriage to Zipporah was seen as a violation of God's commandment for the Israelites to remain separate from foreign nations. Moses had married a woman from a people who were considered outsiders, and this act was viewed with suspicion by some of his followers. But the most shocking part of this story is that Moses was confronted by his own siblings, Aaron and Miriam, for marrying a foreign woman. They criticized him and questioned whether he was truly following God's will. This was a deeply personal sin for Moses, and one that reflected the tension between his divine calling and his human desires. Moses' marriage to Zipporah was not just a personal choice, but a significant act that caused division among the people of Israel. Could this act have been a sign of Moses' human weakness? Was he so focused on his own desires that he disregarded God's commandments? Some scholars believe that Moses' marriage was an act of disobedience that reflected a deeper flaw in his character. It's a reminder that even the greatest leaders can make mistakes, and that their personal decisions can have far-reaching consequences. As we explore Moses' life, we see that his sins were not just isolated incidents, but a pattern of human struggle. Moses was a man who, despite his incredible calling, faced moments of doubt, anger, and disobedience. He wasn't perfect, and that's what makes his story so powerful. Moses' life is a testament to the reality that even the greatest among us are capable of sin. But it's also a story of redemption, of how God can take even our greatest failures and use them for His glory. Moses committed sins that were both shocking and human. From his outburst of anger at the rock, to his act of murder in Egypt, to his marriage to Zipporah, Moses' story is one of struggle, redemption, and grace. These sins are not just footnotes in his story, they are a reminder that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. Moses' story is a reminder that, despite our flaws, we can still fulfill our calling and be used by God in powerful ways. So, what can we learn from Moses' sins? Perhaps it's that our imperfections don't disqualify us from God's calling. Perhaps it's that even in our moments of failure, God can still use us for His purposes. Moses was a man of great faith, but he was also a man who struggled with sin, doubt, and human weakness. His story is one that teaches us about the power of redemption and the unending grace of God. Moses' sins may have been shocking, but his story is far from over. It's a story that continues to inspire, challenge, and remind us that even the greatest among us can fall, but through God's grace, we can rise again.